The receiver felt cool and familiar in my hand, a comforting weight I had held thousands of times before. It was the first Tuesday of November, the day I always made my Thanksgiving calls. For 35 years, since my son David was just a boy, I had hosted Thanksgiving dinner. It was more than a meal. It was the one day a year my little house truly felt like the center of the universe. It was the Super Bowl of my heart. I had my list ready, a sheet of notebook paper with the names of the handful of family members who still made up my world. But the first call, the most important one, was always to David. I punched in the numbers, my heart doing a little flutter of anticipation. I could already smell the turkey roasting, hear the laughter echoing off my floral wallpaper. In my mind, I was already setting the table, using the good china my late husband, Robert, had given me for our 10th anniversary. The phone rang twice before she picked up. Not David, but his wife, Tiffany. Her voice was as crisp and cool as a winter morning. "Hello." "Hi, Tiffany, it's Clara," I said, a warmth spreading through my chest. "How are you, dear?" "Busy, Clara, incredibly busy," she said. I could hear the clacking of a keyboard in the background. "What's up?" I took a breath, ready to launch into my annual, joyous speech about menu planning and coordinating arrival times. I was just calling to start the official Thanksgiving countdown. I wanted to see what time you, David, and the kids were thinking of coming over. I was thinking of serving dinner around 3, but I can adjust if that's too early for Liam and Sophie. The clacking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and unnerving, not the kind of pause that precedes a happy confirmation. It was the kind of silence that holds a hidden blade. "Oh," Tiffany said, and the single syllable was drenched in a kind of pity that made my skin prickle. "Clara, we're not doing Thanksgiving at your house this year." The words didn't register at first. It was like hearing a foreign language, not doing Thanksgiving at my house. That was like saying the sun wasn't rising in the east. It was an impossibility, a glitch in the fabric of our family's reality. "Oh," I said, my voice small. "Is everything all right? Are you all going out of town?" I prayed they were going out of town. That would be a reason I could understand, a reason that didn't feel like a personal rejection. I heard her sigh, a sound of profound exasperation, as if I were a child who just couldn't grasp a simple concept. "No, we're not going out of town. We've just decided to do something different this year. Something a bit more appropriate." Appropriate? The word felt sharp in my mouth. "What do you mean, appropriate?" "Well," she began, and I could picture her perfectly, leaning back in her expensive ergonomic office chair, inspecting her perfectly manicured nails. "We've booked a private room at the Gilded Spoon. A few of David's partners from the firm will be there with their families, and the Hendersons, of course." The Hendersons were her parents, a couple who had always looked at me as if I were a smudge on their otherwise pristine world. It's a networking thing, really. But also, it's just time for an upgrade, a more refined experience. A refined experience. My mind flashed to the image of my worn, comfortable dining room, the table extended with 2 mismatched card tables to accommodate everyone. I thought of the gravy stains on the tablecloth that I could never quite get out, stains that were markers of past joys, of Robert roaring with laughter as he spilled a little on himself. I thought of my grandson Liam, his face smeared with chocolate from my famous pecan pie. Was that not refined? "I don't understand," I whispered, the phone now feeling heavy, cold, and alien in my hand. "Thanksgiving it's always at my house." "Exactly," Tiffany said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial, condescending tone. "It's always at your house. And frankly, Clara, it's getting a little embarrassing. Your place is just so small. It's cluttered. And let's be honest, it's a bit shabby for our friends, for David's colleagues." Shabby? The word landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. I looked around my living room. The sofa, a bit worn on the arms, was where I had rocked David to sleep as a baby. The bookshelf, overflowing with paperbacks, was built by Robert with his own 2 hands. The little scuff marks on the floorboards were from Liam's toy trucks. This wasn't a shabby house. It was a home. It was a museum of my life, of my love. We can't have people thinking we come from that, she continued, her voice a merciless stiletto heel grinding into my heart. It sends the wrong message. It makes it look like David isn't successful, like we're all struggling. She paused and then delivered the final, fatal thrust. And I've already told the children that we're going to a beautiful, fancy restaurant this year because, well, Grandma's house just isn't nice enough for guests anymore. The line went dead in my ears. I wasn't sure if she had hung up or if I had simply stopped hearing. My hand, of its own accord, placed the receiver back in its cradle with a gentle click. I stood there in the middle of my shabby, cluttered, love-filled home, and the silence was deafening. 35 years of tradition, of love, of purpose, all dismissed in a 2-minute phone call. I wasn't just a mother, a grandmother, the keeper of the flame. I was an embarrassment, a liability. I was, in the cold, hard currency of my daughter-in-law's world, too poor to host Thanksgiving. The silence in the house pressed in on me. For a moment, I couldn't move. My feet felt nailed to the scuffed hardwood floor. I looked at the floral wallpaper, a pattern Robert and I had picked out together in 1983. It was peeling slightly in the corner by the ceiling, a tiny imperfection I had meant to fix. Now, all I could see was the shabbiness Tiffany had mentioned. Was she right? Had I become so lost in my memories that I failed to see the decay around me? My gaze drifted to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was crowded with photographs in mismatched frames. David's graduation picture, his grin wide and full of hope. A photo from his wedding to Tiffany, where she looked like a princess and he looked like the luckiest man in the world. A more recent school picture of Liam and Sophie, their smiles a little forced, the way children's smiles are for school photos. And there, in the very center, was my favorite picture, a candid shot of Robert and me, taken on our last Thanksgiving together. He was carving the turkey, a ridiculous paper pilgrim hat on his head, and I was looking at him with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love that it still made my chest ache to see it. This house wasn't shabby. It was lived in. It was loved in. Every worn spot on the carpet, every chip in a coffee mug, was a testament to a life I had built, a life Tiffany saw as a deficit, a stain on her perfect, upwardly mobile existence. I walked slowly into the dining room. The mahogany table, Robert's mother's before it was mine, stood proudly in the center of the room. I ran my hand over its smooth, cool surface. I could almost see them all there, the ghosts of Thanksgivings past. My parents, Robert's parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Over the years, the table had grown quieter as we lost people, but the spirit had always remained. Until now. Now, it was just a piece of wood in an empty room. I sank into one of the dining chairs, the one Robert always used to sit in at the head of the table. The silence was a physical presence, a thick blanket smothering the joyful echoes of the past. The hurt was a sharp, physical pain in my chest, a cold, hard knot of grief. It wasn't just about a missed dinner. It was a fundamental rejection of who I was, of everything I had ever valued. My cooking, my home, my traditions, they weren't just not good enough anymore. They were a source of shame for my only son. For years, I had walked on eggshells around Tiffany. I had learned to bite my tongue when she made passive-aggressive comments about my clothes or my car. I had learned to navigate her labyrinth of unspoken rules and shifting expectations. I did it for David. I did it to maintain access to my grandchildren. I had convinced myself it was a small price to pay for family peace. But I had never paid in installments. I had paid with large, lump sums of my own dignity. I remembered the down payment for their first house, the loan I had given them from Robert's life insurance money. A loan of $20,000 that was never spoken of again, let alone repaid. I had told myself it was an investment in their future, in my grandchildren's future. "It's just that the market is so competitive, Mom," David had said, his voice earnest. "This is our dream house, but we're just a little short. It would mean the world to us." So I wrote the check. I ate canned soup for months to make up for the dip into my savings, but I told myself it was worth it to see them so happy in their sprawling suburban home, a home so much grander than the one I had raised him in. Then there was the childcare. When Liam and Sophie were born, Tiffany had a prestigious new job she couldn't possibly pass up. A live-in nanny was out of the question because she didn't want a stranger raising her children. So I became the default. 3, sometimes 4 days a week, I would make the 45-minute drive to their house, arriving at 7 in the morning and leaving after 8 at night. I changed diapers, soothed fevers, built Lego towers, and read bedtime stories. I poured every last drop of my energy into those children, my heart swelling with a grandmother's love. I never asked for a penny. It was my joy, my privilege. But I remembered one evening, after a particularly grueling day with a teething Sophie, I had overheard Tiffany on the phone with one of her friends. "Oh, the childcare situation is perfect," she had chirped. "It's completely free. David's mom just loves doing it. Honestly, what else would she be doing with her time?" What else would I be doing? I could have been traveling, as Robert and I had always planned to do. I could have been taking the pottery class I'd always dreamed of. I could have been volunteering. I could have been living my own life, not just serving as a supporting character in hers. But I had silenced that voice of resentment. I told myself that family makes sacrifices. The knot in my chest tightened. The sacrifices had only ever gone in one direction. I thought about the heirlooms. My mother's diamond earrings. I had wanted to give them to Sophie when she was older. But one year, David's sure-thing investment had gone sour. He was in a panic, on the verge of financial ruin, he'd claimed. "Tiffany would kill me if she knew," he'd whispered to me over the phone, his voice thick with shame. "I just need $5,000 to cover the loss before she finds out. I'll pay you back, Mom, I swear." I didn't have $5,000 in cash. My pension was modest, my savings finite, but I had the earrings. I took them to a jeweler the next day. The man's face was sad as he told me their value. "These are beautiful from another time," he'd said. I sold them, and the history they carried, for a fraction of their worth, and gave the money to David. He never mentioned it again. The thank you was as absent as the repayment. I stood up and walked over to the built-in china cabinet in the corner of the dining room. My reflection was a faint, ghostly image in the glass. I looked tired. I looked old. Behind my reflection, the stacks of china stood in perfect, orderly rows. The good china I had been so excited to use. It was a beautiful set, with a delicate pattern of blue flowers around the rim. I opened the cabinet door and took out a single dinner plate. It was cool to the touch. I thought about the hands that had touched this plate before me, Robert's mother, his grandmother. Generations of women who had built their families around a dining table. Tiffany didn't have good china. She had a set of stark, white, square plates from a designer store. They were fashionable, she had explained once, and unfussy. There were no memories attached to them. They were as cold and transactional as her view of the world. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of my grief. It was an unfamiliar feeling. I had spent so many years suppressing my own needs, my own feelings, that I had forgotten what true anger felt like. It was clarifying. It was energizing. She had called my home shabby. She had called my traditions embarrassing. She had used my love as a convenience, my generosity as an expectation, and my financial prudence as a sign of poverty. She had not just closed a door on Thanksgiving. She had tried to bulldoze the entire foundation of my life. I put the plate back in the cabinet, my hand no longer trembling. I closed the glass door with a soft, definitive click. They wanted a refined experience. They wanted an upgrade. They thought the gilded spoon, with its starched tablecloths and its tiny, artfully arranged portions of food, was the pinnacle of success. A thought began to form in my mind. It was a wild, audacious, completely insane thought. It started as a tiny spark, a flicker of defiance in the darkness of my empty dining room. I had spent my entire life serving others, putting their needs before my own. I had saved. I had sacrificed. I had been responsible. Robert's life insurance, the proceeds from the sale of his small hardware store, my own modest savings. I had guarded that nest egg fiercely, seeing it as a safety net for my old age. But what was the point of a safety net if you were already in a free fall? The spark grew into a flame. The gilded spoon. The name itself was an insult, a parody of genuine quality. It represented everything I found hollow and distasteful about Tiffany's world. It was a place of performance, not substance. A place to be seen, not a place to connect. My house was not a restaurant, but maybe it could be. No, that wasn't right. The thought clarified, sharpened, and took on a breathtaking, terrifying shape. I wasn't going to compete with the gilded spoon. I was going to offer an alternative. I walked back into the living room and looked at the picture of Robert on the mantelpiece. His eyes seemed to twinkle as if he were in on the joke. He had always been the dreamer, the risk-taker. I had been the practical one. "You're the anchor, Clara," he used to say. "You keep the ship from drifting away." But the ship wasn't drifting. It had been torpedoed, and an anchor is no good when you're trying to swim for your life. "What do you think, Robert?" I whispered to the photograph. "Am I crazy?" The idea was madness. It was financially reckless. It was the single most impulsive thought I'd had in my 70 years on this earth. But it felt right. It felt like the only thing to do. I wouldn't just host my own Thanksgiving. I would host Thanksgiving for everyone who felt left out, for everyone who didn't have a place to go, for everyone who understood that the value of a meal is not in its price tag, but in the love with which it is served. My gaze fell upon the telephone, the instrument of my morning's humiliation. I picked up the phone book, another shabby, outdated object in Tiffany's world, and looked up the number for a commercial real estate agent. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, joyful drumbeat. I didn't know if I was running toward a brilliant new future or off the edge of a financial cliff. But for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was the one doing the steering. The anchor was coming up. A few days passed in a blur of quiet heartache and simmering rage. I moved through my house like a ghost, the silence a constant reminder of the void that had been blasted into my life. The phone remained quiet. David didn't call. I knew, with a certainty that was its own kind of pain, that he either agreed with Tiffany or lacked the courage to defy her. In my darker moments, I wasn't sure which was worse. The only call I received was from my grandson, Liam. He called on Friday afternoon, his voice a small, hesitant whisper. He must have used his tablet to call me when his parents weren't around. "Grandma," he said, his voice wobbly. "Liam, sweetheart, it's so good to hear your voice," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "Grandma, Mommy says we can't come to your house for Thanksgiving." "I know, honey, Mommy told me." I tried to keep my voice light, but it was a Herculean effort. She said your house is messy," he whispered, as if confessing a terrible secret. "But I like your house, Grandma. It smells like cookies. And I like the secret drawer where you keep the lollipops." A tear slipped down my cheek. "I like it too, sweetheart." "Why can't we come?" he asked, the simple, unanswerable question of a child who doesn't understand the cruel arithmetic of social climbing. "I don't want to go to a fancy restaurant. I want your turkey, and your pie, and I want to play with the toy soldiers in the attic." "I know, my love, I know," I said, my heart breaking into a million tiny pieces. "I'm going to miss you so much." "I'll miss you too, Grandma," he said, and then, in a rushed whisper, "I have to go, Mommy's coming." The line went dead. That call was the final push I needed. This wasn't just about me and my hurt feelings anymore. It was about my grandchildren being taught that my love, my home, was second-rate. It was about them learning that appearances were more important than family, that money was more valuable than memories. I would not let that be the lesson my grandchildren learned from this Thanksgiving. The next morning, I put on my good coat, the one I saved for funerals and special occasions, and I walked downtown. The air was crisp, and the autumn leaves crunched under my feet. I walked with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. I bypassed the shiny, modern buildings that housed the banks and law firms and headed for the older part of town, the part with cobblestone streets and buildings that had stood for 100 years. There it was, on the corner of Maple and Elm. The Corner Bistro. It was a local institution, a place that had been serving coffee and meatloaf since before I was born, but it had seen better days. The paint on the sign was peeling, and a for sale sign was taped inside the front window, looking as forlorn as a surrendered flag. Through the window, I could see the worn linoleum floors, the red vinyl booths with their patched-up tiers, and the long Formica countertop. It was, by every measure, a failing business. It was shabby. It was outdated. It was everything Tiffany would sneer at, and I loved it instantly. I pushed open the door, and a little bell jingled overhead. The smell of stale coffee and fried onions hung in the air. An old man sat at the counter, stirring his coffee with a slow, methodical rhythm. A young waitress was wiping down a table in the corner, her movements weary. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up. I'd like to talk to the owner," I said, my voice sounding surprisingly steady. The old man at the counter swiveled on his stool. He had a kind, tired face etched with the lines of 1,000 worries. "You're talkin' to him," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Arthur Henderson, what can I do for you?" I introduced myself, and for the next hour, Arthur told me the story of the corner bistro. It had been in his family for 3 generations. He had started working there as a boy, washing dishes for his father. He had taken it over in the 70s and had run it ever since. "This place used to be the heart of the town," he said, his eyes scanning the empty booths with a deep, abiding sadness. "Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, we were packed. You couldn't get a seat on a Saturday morning." "What happened?" I asked softly. He sighed, a long, rattling sound. "Time happened, the world changed. Places like that," he said, jerking his thumb in the general direction of the newer, fancier part of town, opened up. "The Gilded Spoon, places with fancy menus and wine lists. People don't want meatloaf and mashed potatoes anymore. They want, I don't even know what they want, something drizzled with balsamic glaze." He told me he was losing money every month. His wife had passed away a few years ago, his kids had moved out of state, and he was just tired. Tired of fighting a losing battle. Selling was the only option, but he was afraid some developer would just buy it, tear it down, and put up a condominium. "This place has a soul," he said, patting the counter as if it were a beloved pet. "I'd hate to see that soul bulldozed." I listened to his story, and in it, I heard echoes of my own. We were both from another time, clinging to values the world seemed to have forgot. We were both being pushed out by a newer, shinier, colder reality. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my decision solidifying into something real and tangible, "I'm interested in buying your restaurant." He stared at me, his jaw slack. The waitress, who had been pretending not to listen, dropped her rag on the floor. You are," Arthur stammered. "Lady, with all due respect, did you not just hear a word I said? This place is a sinking ship." "I heard every word," I said. "You said it used to be the heart of the town. I think it can be again. A heart doesn't need to be shiny. It just needs to be strong and true, and it needs to be open." We talked for another 2 hours. I didn't tell him the whole story about Tiffany and Thanksgiving. I just told him that I was a widow with some savings, looking for a new purpose in life. I told him about my love of cooking, of feeding people. I told him my dream wasn't to get rich, but to create a place of community, a place where everyone felt welcome. He was skeptical, but he was also intrigued. He saw something in my eyes, I think. Not the shrewd calculation of an investor, but the desperate, hopeful fire of someone with nothing left to lose. That afternoon, I went to the bank. I sat down with Mr. Abernathy, the financial advisor who had managed Roberts and my finances for 30 years. He was a kind, gentle man who had helped me navigate the terrifying world of investments and taxes after Robert's death. "Clara," he said, his brow furrowed with concern as I laid out my plan. "This is highly irregular. A restaurant is one of the riskiest investments you can make. 90% of them fail in the first year." "I know the risks, James," I said. "Your portfolio is designed for stability and modest growth," he continued, pointing at a chart on his computer screen. "It's meant to provide you with a comfortable, secure retirement. Liquidating these assets to buy a failing diner it's the financial equivalent of jumping out of an airplane without a parachute." "Perhaps," I said, "but my comfortable, secure retirement is starting to feel like a very comfortable, secure prison. James, Robert, and we never took big risks. We worked hard, we saved our money, we did everything the right way. And for what? So I could sit alone in my house until I die, with a healthy bank account and an empty heart." I told him a little more of the story then. I told him about the phone call, about the feeling of being discarded. His expression softened from concern to a quiet, simmering anger on my behalf. "That daughter-in-law of yours," he said, shaking his head. "I never liked her." He spent the next hour showing me exactly what a financial catastrophe this could be. He printed out spreadsheets and charts showing the worst-case scenarios. He did his job, and I was grateful for his diligence, but my mind was made up. "James," I said, placing my hand on his, "I have been responsible my entire life. I have been practical. I have been the anchor. Now, for the first time, I am going to be the storm. I need you to tell me how to turn these stocks and bonds into cash. As quickly as possible." He looked at me for a long moment, and then a slow smile spread across his face. "All right, Clara," he said, leaning back in his chair. "All right, Captain, let's go start a storm." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of activity. There were lawyers, accountants, health inspectors, and contractors. Arthur, the bistro's owner, agreed to a price that was more than fair, especially when I promised him that I would not change the name of the restaurant, but merely add to it. It would become Clara's Kitchen at the Corner Bistro. I also offered him a lifetime supply of free coffee and a permanent seat at the counter, which I think sealed the deal. The legal and financial processes were bewildering, but with Mr. Abernathy and a lawyer he recommended, I navigated them. The most terrifying moment was signing the final papers, transferring a lifetime of savings into this one crazy venture. As the pen slid across the paper, I felt a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. What had I done? But then I thought of Liam's sad voice on the phone. I thought of Tiffany's smug, dismissive tone. I thought of the empty chair at the head of my dining room table, and the panic subsided, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. The bistro staff consisted of 2 people: Sandy, the weary waitress, and a cynical, heavily tattooed cook named Frank who seemed to communicate exclusively through grunts. They were both convinced I was going to fire them. On my first day as the official owner, I called them both into the empty dining room. "I know you're probably worried about your jobs," I began, "and you have every right to be, but I'm not here to fire you. I'm here to ask for your help." Frank grunted, which I took to mean, "With what?" "This place has good bones," I said, "but it needs more than a coat of paint. It needs a new heart, and I can't do it alone. Sandy, you've been here for 10 years, you know the customers, you know what works and what doesn't. Frank, Arthur told me you're the best short-order cook in the state, even if your attitude could use some work." A flicker of something, surprise, pride, crossed Frank's face before he settled back into his usual scowl. "I'm not asking you to work for me," I said. "I'm asking you to work with me. I want to build something here, something special. And I'm willing to pay you both 20% above what Arthur was paying you, plus a share of the profits if we can turn this place around." Sandy's eyes widened. "A share of the profits. Lady, there are no profits." "Not yet," I said, a smile touching my lips for what felt like the first time in weeks. "Not yet. Output limit REACHED. Waiting to continue." Frank stared at me, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The tattoos on his knuckles spelled out hard luck, which seemed entirely too appropriate for the situation. He was a mountain of a man, and his silence was more intimidating than any shouting could be. Sandy, on the other hand, just looked stunned, her mouth slightly agape, as if she was trying to compute a math problem far beyond her capabilities. "A share of the profits," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara." That's what Arthur always used to say. One day, when the ship comes in, the ship never came in, it sank. We're standing in the wreckage. "Then we'll have to build a new ship," I said, my voice filled with more confidence than I actually felt. "And this time, we'll build it right. I'm not some corporate suit. I'm a grandmother who knows how to cook. I know what people want. They don't want foam or drizzles or deconstructed anything. They want to feel full. They want to feel welcome. They want to feel like someone cared about the food they're eating." I looked from Sandy's doubtful face to Frank's stony one. "I can't promise you this will be easy," I continued. "It's going to be hard work. We have less than 3 weeks until Thanksgiving, and I want this place to be ready. Not just ready, but perfect. But I can promise you this, I will be here with you every step of the way." I'll be scrubbing the floors, I'll be peeling the potatoes, and I'll be the last one to leave at night. I believe in this place. I just need two people to believe in it with me. The silence stretched on. I held my breath. My entire insane, life-altering plan hinged on this moment, on these two strangers. Finally, Frank uncrossed his arms. He took a step forward and pointed a thick finger at the ancient, grease-caked grill in the kitchen. "That piece of junk hasn't been properly cleaned since the Nixon administration," he grunted. "The flat top's warped, heat's uneven." "Then we'll get a new one," I said without hesitation. He then pointed to the walk-in refrigerator. "Compressor's shot. It's about as cold as a summer's day in there." "We'll get it fixed," I said. He looked me dead in the eye, his gaze piercing. "You got the money for all that, or is this all just talk?" It was a fair question. The truth was, I hadn't budgeted for major equipment overhauls. My nest egg was already shrinking at an alarming rate, but I couldn't show weakness. Not now. "I have the money to do what needs to be done," I said, meeting his gaze. He held my gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment as if trying to see into my soul, searching for the lie. Then, to my utter astonishment, he gave a short, sharp nod. "All right," he rumbled. "I'm in. But if I'm gonna be a partner in this circus, I'm not cooking on that garbage heap." He turned and walked back into the kitchen, picked up a scraper, and began attacking the grill with a ferocity that was almost frightening. I turned to Sandy, my heart soaring. One down, one to go. She was wringing her hands, a million emotions playing across her face: hope, fear, exhaustion, and a tiny, fragile spark of excitement. "Clara, I have 2 kids," she said quietly. "I can't afford to be part of a sinking ship. I need a steady paycheck." "You'll get one," I promised. "Starting today with the raise. Whether we succeed or fail, you will not lose a dime. That's my guarantee." She looked over at Frank, who was now dismantling the hood vents with a single-minded determination. She looked at me, standing there in my good coat, probably looking like a crazy old woman who had lost her mind. She looked around at the dingy, tired old diner that had been her prison for a decade. "A share of the profits, you said?" she asked, a small, tentative smile playing on her lips. "A share of the profits," I confirmed. "Well," she said, untying the dirty apron from around her waist and tossing it into a trash can, "I guess I'd better go find a clean one. We've got a lot of work to do, boss." The word boss sent a strange thrill through me. I wasn't just Clara, the lonely widow, the embarrassing mother. I was the boss. The next 2 weeks were the hardest, most exhilarating, and most exhausting of my life. I had thought I was just buying a restaurant. I hadn't realized I was enlisting in a war. My enemies were decades of grime, faulty wiring, and plumbing that seemed to have a personal vendetta against me. But I was not alone. Frank, it turned out, was not just a cook. He was a mechanical genius. He seemed to know instinctively how every appliance worked, or more accurately, why it didn't. He rewired the faulty lighting, coaxed the ancient dishwasher back to life, and negotiated with a scrap dealer to trade in the old grill for a reconditioned, top-of-the-line model at a price that seemed almost impossibly low. "You know a guy?" I asked, amazed. "I know a lot of guys," he grunted, which I was beginning to understand was his version of a lengthy explanation. Sandy, for her part, was the organizational heart of our operation. She knew where every spare light bulb and forgotten box of napkins was stored. She managed the painters and the plumbers with an efficiency that would have made a drill sergeant proud. She also appointed herself my protector. "You can't be lifting that," she'd say, taking a heavy box of cleaning supplies from my hands. "You go sit down and make a list. That's what bosses do." But I didn't want to just make lists. I wanted to be part of the transformation. So I scrubbed and I polished and I painted. I got down on my hands and knees and scraped ancient gum from under the tables. With every bit of dirt I removed, I felt like I was clearing away a piece of my own past, my own inertia. We worked from dawn until long past midnight, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of shared purpose. Slowly, miraculously, the old bistro began to change. We painted the walls a warm, creamy yellow. We replaced the torn red vinyl on the booths with a cheerful blue fabric that Sandy found at a discount store. I took down the faded, generic prints of Parisian street scenes and hung up framed photographs of our own town's history that I found in the library archives. The heart of the transformation, however, was the kitchen. It was my sanctuary. While Frank was rebuilding the physical space, I was rebuilding its soul. The first thing I did was throw out everything in the pantry. The canned vegetables, the powdered mashed potatoes, the tubs of margarine, it all went into the dumpster. "What are you doing?" Frank had asked, looking genuinely alarmed as I tossed a 10-pound can of gravy base. "We are never, ever serving food out of a can again," I declared. "From now on, everything will be fresh. Everything will be real." I spent my mornings, before the contractors arrived, developing the menu. It wasn't a menu so much as a collection of my life's greatest culinary hits. Robert's favorite pot roast. My mother's chicken and dumplings. The macaroni and cheese recipe I had perfected over 30 years of birthday parties and potlucks. And of course my Thanksgiving feast, the herb-roasted turkey, the sausage and cornbread stuffing, the creamy mashed potatoes, the green bean casserole made with fresh mushrooms and a cream sauce from scratch, and my famous pecan pie, the one Liam loved so much. I cooked for Frank and Sandy every day, trying out my recipes, fine-tuning the flavors. Frank was my harshest critic. "Needs more salt," he'd grunt after tasting my pot roast. "The dumplings are a little heavy," he'd declare after a bowl of my chicken soup. But I knew he was coming around when, one afternoon, I made my signature apple pie. I set a slice in front of him, warm from the oven, with a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting on top. He took a bite, then another, then another. He ate the entire slice without saying a word, a look of intense concentration on his face. He pushed the empty plate away, and I braced myself for the criticism. He looked at me, and for the first time since I'd met him, the hard lines around his eyes seemed to soften. "It's good," he said. And then, after a long pause, he added, "Tastes like my grandma's." It was the highest compliment he could have possibly given. As the days flew by, we began to attract a small crowd of curious onlookers. The regulars from the old bistro would press their faces against the glass, wondering what was happening to their beloved haunt. I made a point of going out to talk to them. "We'll be open soon," I'd promise, "and the coffee will still be hot and fresh." One afternoon, I was outside, sweeping the sidewalk when a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. The driver's side window hummed down and my blood turned to ice. It was Tiffany. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and a look of profound disgust as she surveyed the building. David was in the passenger seat. He wouldn't look at me. "My God," Tiffany said, her voice dripping with scorn. "Is this some kind of joke?" I leaned my broom against the wall and walked slowly to the car. I didn't feel afraid. I didn't feel sad. I just felt a great, weary anger. "Hello, Tiffany," I said, my voice calm. "What are you doing here?" "What are we doing here?" She scoffed. "We're staging an intervention. David, tell your mother how insane this is." David finally turned to look at me. His face was a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and something I couldn't quite decipher. Pity. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Mr. Abernathy called me. He said you cashed out your retirement accounts, all of them, to buy this dump." "It's not a dump," I said evenly. "It's my restaurant." "It's a financial suicide mission." He hissed. "You're going to lose everything, everything Dad worked for, everything we were supposed to," he trailed off, but I could finish the sentence for him. "Everything we were supposed to inherit." Tiffany took off her sunglasses, and I could see the cold fury in her eyes. "This is because of the Thanksgiving thing, isn't it?" She sneered. "This is some pathetic, passive-aggressive revenge plot. You couldn't handle the fact that we were finally moving on, upgrading our lives, so you decided to do this to embarrass us." "Embarrass you?" A laugh, harsh and humorless, escaped my lips. "Oh, Tiffany, you have no idea what real embarrassment is. Real embarrassment is having to explain to your grandchildren that their grandmother's love isn't refined enough. Real embarrassment is realizing you've raised a son who values his business partner's opinions more than his own mother's heart." David flinched as if I had slapped him. "That's not fair, Mom." "Isn't it?" I leaned closer to the car, my voice dropping to a steely whisper. You didn't call me, David. Not once. Not to ask if I was okay. Not to explain. Not even to pretend to be sorry. You just let your wife dismiss me like I was a piece of old furniture, and you said nothing. You stood by and said nothing. I was going to call, he mumbled, his gaze falling to his lap. It's just been so busy at work. The excuse was so weak, so pathetic, that it was almost comical. Tiffany had heard enough. Fine, she snapped. Have it your way. Throw your life away. Run your little soup kitchen for has-beens and hobos, but don't come crying to us when you're bankrupt. And don't for a second think that you are welcome at the Gilded Spoon on Thanksgiving. We have a reputation to maintain. She hit the button and the window began to glide up, sealing her off in her climate-controlled, sanitized world. But before it closed, I had one last thing to say. Don't worry, Tiffany, I said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. I won't be at the Gilded Spoon. I have my own reservations. Here, and unlike your dinner, mine is already sold out. It was a complete and utter lie. We hadn't even set an opening date yet, but the look on her face, the shock, the confusion, the flicker of pure, unadulterated rage was worth every penny I had spent so far. She gunned the engine, and the Mercedes peeled away from the curb, leaving a cloud of exhaust in its wake. I stood there on the sidewalk for a long moment, my heart pounding. The confrontation had been draining, but it had also been liberating. The last cord had been cut. I was no longer defined by their expectations or their approval. I turned and went back inside the restaurant. Sandy was standing by the door, her eyes wide. She had heard everything. Sold out, she said, a note of panic in her voice. Clara, we don't even have a working oven yet. I picked up my broom and began to sweep again, a feeling of fierce, joyful determination coursing through me. Then I guess we'd better get to work, I said. Because now we have an opening day, Thanksgiving. The lie I had told Tiffany became my rallying cry. Sold out for Thanksgiving. Became our mantra, our impossible, terrifying goal. The final 10 days were a frantic race against the clock. The new oven arrived, but it was bigger than the old one and didn't fit through the door. Frank had to remove the door frame, and a friendly contractor Sandy knew had to reinstall it. The walk-in refrigerator was fixed, but the day it was turned back on, a pipe burst in the basement, flooding the storeroom. We lost 100 pounds of potatoes. Through it all, we worked. Arthur, the former owner, started showing up every morning for his free coffee and ended up staying all day, offering advice and lending a hand. He taught me how to navigate the labyrinthine world of food suppliers and how to get the best prices on produce. My friends from my old life, the ones I had neglected during my years as David and Tiffany's servant, started to appear. Eleanor, my next-door neighbor, showed up with a team of her garden club ladies, and they planted beautiful autumn flowers in the window boxes. Maria, who I used to volunteer with at the hospital, came by and polished all the silverware until it gleamed. The community was rallying around us, drawn in by the smell of fresh paint and the rumor of a woman who was crazy enough to bet her life savings on a dream. People would pop their heads in to see the progress, and I always had a pot of coffee and a fresh-baked cookie for them. The bistro was coming back to life, and it was becoming what I had always hoped it would be, a place for people to gather. I still hadn't heard from David, and a part of my heart ached with that silence. But I was too busy, too focused, too full of purpose to let the ache consume me. 3 days before Thanksgiving, we had our final health inspection. A stern-faced woman named Ms. Albright went over the entire restaurant with a fine-toothed comb. She checked temperatures, inspected surfaces, and scrutinized our food handling procedures. It was the most nerve-wracking 2 hours of my life. At the end of it, she stood in the middle of my gleaming kitchen, her clipboard in her hand, her expression unreadable. Well, Mrs. Foster, she said, and my stomach plummeted. Everything seems to be in order, she continued, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. In fact, this is one of the cleanest kitchens I've seen in my 10 years on the job. She signed the certificate with a flourish and handed it to me. Welcome to the neighborhood. I almost burst into tears. We had done it. We were a real, licensed, fully operational restaurant. That night, Sandy, Frank, Arthur, and I sat in one of the new blue booths, too exhausted to move. "So," Sandy said, breaking the silence, "we're sold out for Thanksgiving. Who exactly did we sell out to?" It was a valid question. In my fit of defiance, I had created a promise I had no idea how to keep. "We are going to host a free Thanksgiving dinner," I announced. "For anyone and everyone who has nowhere else to go. For the lonely, for the hungry, for the people who, for whatever reason, feel left out. We're going to put a sign in the window, and we're going to open our doors." Frank grunted. "That's a lot of turkey." "I know," I said, "and we're not going to charge a penny." Sandy looked at me as if I had well and truly lost my mind. "Clara, we're broke. The bank account is practically empty. We can't afford to give away 100 free meals." She was right. I had poured every last dollar into the renovation. I was running on fumes. I looked at their worried faces, and for a moment my own confidence wavered. Had I brought them all on this crazy journey just to crash and burn before we even began? Just then, the bell above the door jingled. We all turned. It was Mr. Abernathy, my financial advisor, holding a large manila envelope. "Evening, Clara," he said, his eyes twinkling. I saw the lights on, thought I'd drop this by. He handed me the envelope. I opened it. Inside was a check, made out to Clara's kitchen at the corner bistro, for $5,000, and under it was a letter. "Dear Clara," it read, "I have been managing money for 40 years, and I have always advised my clients to be prudent, to be cautious, and to be rational. And then I met you. You reminded me that some things are more important than a balanced portfolio. My wife passed away 5 years ago, and the holidays are a lonely time. I would be honored to be your first investor. And your first official, paying customer for Thanksgiving dinner. Consider this a down payment on a slice of that apple pie you told me about. Sincerely, James Abernathy." The tears I had been holding back for weeks finally came. They weren't tears of sadness or anger, but tears of overwhelming, profound gratitude. We weren't broke. We had something more valuable than money. We had a community. "Well, Frank," I said, wiping my eyes and looking at the check, "it looks like you'd better go order some more turkeys." Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and clear. I was at the restaurant by 4 a.m., but I hadn't really slept. I had dozed in a chair in my living room, too wired with a mixture of terror and excitement to go to bed. The turkeys, all 20 of them, were my first priority. Frank was already there, a hulking silhouette in the pre-dawn darkness of the kitchen, his movements economical and precise as he started loading the massive birds into the new ovens. The smell of roasting turkey, rich with herbs and butter, began to fill the air, and it was the most beautiful smell in the world. It was the scent of my childhood, the scent of my marriage, the scent of every good memory I had ever made. It was the smell of home. Sandy and Arthur arrived at 5, their faces etched with the same nervous energy I felt. We had spent the entirety of the previous day, Thanksgiving Eve, in a marathon of preparation. The sheer scale of it was staggering. My little team, which had now swelled to include Elena, Maria, and a half-dozen other friends and volunteers, had peeled 150 pounds of potatoes. We had chopped 30 pounds of onions, 40 pounds of celery, and 20 pounds of carrots. We had baked 30 pecan pies, 30 apple pies, and 40 pumpkin pies, their warm, spicy scent battling the savory aroma of the roasting turkeys for dominance. The day had been a beautiful, chaotic ballet of community. Elena and her garden club ladies, their hands as skilled with peeler as they were with trowels, sat at a long table, a mountain of potatoes between them, their gossip and laughter filling the dining room. Maria, who had organized the volunteers with military precision, directed a team of teenagers from the local high school who had come to earn their service hours. They were washing dishes, mopping floors, and setting the tables, their youthful energy a welcome addition to our weary crew. Frank, in his own gruff way, had become the beloved, terrifying commander of the kitchen. He assigned tasks with minimal words, pointing at sacks of vegetables and then at a cutting board, and the volunteers scrambled to obey. But I saw him quietly showing a clumsy teenage boy the proper way to hold a chef's knife, his big hands gentle as he guided the boys. I saw him slip a warm cookie to a little girl who had come with her mother to drop off a donation of canned goods. His heart, I was learning, was as big as his scowl. We had put a simple, hand-painted sign in the window a few days earlier. Free Thanksgiving dinner. All are welcome. 12 p.m. until the food runs out. We had no idea if anyone would come. We had spread the word through churches and community centers, but I was terrified that we would have a mountain of food and an empty dining room. What if nobody shows up? Sandy had whispered to me late last night as we were stacking the last of the clean plates. Then you and I and Frank are going to be eating turkey leftovers for a year, I had said with a laugh, but the fear was real. Now, on Thanksgiving morning, the fear was a hard knot in my stomach. The dining room was silent and beautiful. The tables were covered in crisp white paper cloths, which I had bought instead of linen to save money. In the center of each table was a small, simple bouquet of autumn flowers from a leaner's garden. Every salt and pepper shaker was full, every fork and knife was polished. The room was humming with potential, waiting to be filled. By 9 a.m., the kitchen was in full swing. The mashed potatoes were being whipped into creamy peaks in a giant industrial mixer. The green bean casserole, bubbling with its rich, from-scratch mushroom sauce, was ready to go into the ovens as soon as the turkeys came out. The gravy, made from gallons of homemade turkey stock and the rich drippings from the roasting pans, simmered on the stove, its aroma making my mouth water. I was in charge of the stuffing, my signature cornbread and sausage recipe. It was a task I refused to delegate. I stood at a massive stainless steel counter, crumbling pans of cooled cornbread into a bowl the size of a small bathtub, my hands moving with the practiced ease of 35 years of Thanksgiving mornings. As I worked, my mind drifted. I thought of David. I wondered what his morning was like. Was he in his sleek, minimalist kitchen, watching Tiffany direct a catering team? Or was he sitting in his silent living room, missing the familiar chaos of my house? I wondered if he had thought of me at all. A sharp pang of sadness went through me, an old, familiar ache. I pushed it away. I didn't have time for sadness today. Today was for the future, not the past. At 11 o'clock, the first turkeys came out of the oven, golden brown and glistening. Frank lifted them with a practiced ease, placing them on carving stations we had set up. The smell was intoxicating. We were ready, or so I thought. At 11:30, Arthur, who we had posted as a lookout at the front window, called out, his voice tight with alarm. "Clara, you'd better come see this." I wiped my hands on my apron and walked out to the dining room. I followed his gaze out the front window, and my heart stopped. A line had formed. It wasn't a small line. It stretched from our front door, down the block, and around the corner. There were dozens of people, perhaps 100 or more, bundled in coats and hats against the November chill, waiting patiently. There were old men and women, clearly on their own. There were young families with small children. There were people whose worn clothes and weary faces told a story of hard times. "My God," Sandy whispered from behind me. They came. My fear of an empty room was instantly replaced by a new, more terrifying fear. What if we didn't have enough? I looked back at the kitchen, at Frank who had followed me out, his face an unreadable mask. I looked at the volunteers, their eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and panic. I looked at the line of people outside, their faces full of a quiet, fragile hope. This was no longer about Tiffany or David or the gilded spoon. This was about that old man in the thin coat, shivering in the cold. It was about that young mother, trying to keep her two toddlers from running into the street. It was about the promise I had made, not just to myself, but to all of them. I took a deep breath, and the calm that settled over me was absolute. This was what I was born to do. "All right, everyone," I said, my voice ringing out with a clarity and authority that surprised even me. "Listen up. We have a lot of hungry people to feed, and we are not going to turn a single one of them away. Sandy, you and Maria will manage the dining room. Get people seated, get them drinks. Arthur, you're on the door. Welcome every single person like they are the guest of honor, because today they are. Frank, you and I will run the kitchen. We'll carve the turkeys, we'll plate the food, and we'll keep it coming. Volunteers, we need you to run the food, clear the tables, and wash the dishes. And most importantly," I looked around at the faces of my little army, "I want everyone to smile. This is not a soup kitchen. This is a celebration. This is Thanksgiving. Let's open the doors. At precisely 12 o'clock, Arthur unlocked the front door. The little bell jingled and the first guest, a stooped, elderly woman with kind, watery eyes, stepped inside. "Welcome to Clara's kitchen," Arthur said, his voice booming. "Happy Thanksgiving." She looked around the warm, cheerful room, her eyes wide with wonder, as if she had just stepped into another world. It smells like my mother's house," she whispered. And then they began to pour in. The room filled up in minutes, the low hum of conversation and the clatter of silverware replacing the anxious silence. My team moved like a well-oiled machine. Sandy and Maria were masters of hospitality, seating families and lonely individuals with equal grace, making sure everyone had a hot cup of coffee or a glass of cider. In the kitchen, Frank and I were a whirlwind of motion. He carved the turkeys with the precision of a surgeon, the meat falling away in perfect, juicy slices. I was on the plating line, scooping out generous portions of mashed potatoes, stuffing, and vegetables. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We were communicating in a language of shared rhythm and purpose, a frantic, joyful dance of service. The food runners, my army of high school volunteers, flew in and out of the kitchen, their faces flushed with excitement. Table 7 needs more gravy. We're out of rolls on table 3. We kept the food coming. As soon as a serving platter was empty, it was refilled. The first seating finished, and as they left, their faces full of gratitude, a new wave of people from the still enormous line took their places. We fed them all. We fed the mailman who was working on the holiday, the firefighters from the station down the street who were on duty, a group of college students who couldn't afford to go home. I stepped out of the kitchen for a brief moment to catch my breath and survey the scene. Every single seat was filled. The room was alive with the sound of laughter and conversation. A little boy, no older than my grandson Liam, was giggling as his father tried to wipe a dollop of whipped cream from his nose. An old man was telling a story to a young couple at his table, his hands gesturing wildly. They weren't strangers anymore. They were neighbors. They were a community. They were a family. My eyes welled up with tears. This was it. This was the refined experience I had been searching for. It had nothing to do with starched tablecloths or fancy wine glasses. It was the richness of human connection. It was the warmth of a shared meal. It was the simple, profound beauty of a full room and full hearts. As I stood there, soaking it all in, the bell on the front door jingled again. I turned, expecting to see another hungry guest. But my heart froze in my chest. It was David. He was alone. He stood just inside the doorway, looking completely out of place in his expensive cashmere coat. His eyes scanned the boisterous, crowded room, a look of utter bewilderment on his face. He looked lost. He looked like a man who had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a foreign country. Our eyes met across the room. The laughter and chatter seemed to fade away. It was just me and my son, standing on opposite sides of a vast, silent canyon that we had both helped to create. He took a hesitant step forward, his mouth opening as if to speak. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for the impact. This was it. The confrontation I had been dreading and on some level hoping for was finally here. David took another step into the restaurant and then another. He moved awkwardly, like a man walking on an unfamiliar and shifting deck. The happy diners, wrapped up in their own worlds, paid him no mind, parting around him like a river around a stone. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, swallowed up by the vibrant life of the room I had created. His expensive coat, which would have looked at home at the Gilded Spoon, here looked like a costume, a flimsy defense against a world he didn't understand. His eyes were locked on mine, and in them I saw a storm of conflicting emotions. There was shame, yes, and a deep, bottomless well of sadness. But there was something else too, something I hadn't seen in a very long time, a flicker of the little boy who used to run to me when he was lost or hurt. I stayed where I was, by the entrance to the kitchen, my hands tucked into the pockets of my apron. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, and in every version I was either screaming at him or weeping. But now, in the real moment, I felt a strange and powerful calm. The battle had already been fought and won. not against him, but against the despair he and his wife had inflicted. This room, full of strangers who felt like family, was my victory. I didn't need to shout. He finally reached me, stopping a few feet away. The sounds of the restaurant rushed back in, the clatter of plates, the swell of laughter, the faint, tinny sound of a Christmas carol Sandy had put on the old sound system. "Mom," he said, his voice raspy, as if he hadn't used it in a very long time. "Hello, David," I said. My voice was even, steady. It was the voice of the boss, not just the mother. He gestured vaguely at the bustling dining room, a look of profound disbelief on his face. What is all this?" "This is Thanksgiving," I said simply. "But who are all these people?" "They're my guests," I said. "They're people who needed a place to go today, people who needed a hot meal, people who just didn't want to be alone." I paused, letting the words hang in the air between us. It turns out there are a lot of people like that in the world. He flinched, and I knew he had understood the unspoken part of my statement. "You were supposed to be my people, and you left me alone." He looked down at his perfectly polished shoes, then back up at me. "I went to the house," he said quietly. "It was empty. The lights were off. I thought something had happened to you." I panicked. "I called your cell phone, but it went to voicemail. And then I remembered what Tiffany said about this place." His voice dripped with a scorn that I knew was directed more at himself than at the restaurant. "I've been busy," I said, a masterpiece of understatement. "Mom, He stopped, swallowed hard. The glib confidence that he usually wore like a second skin was gone, stripped away, leaving him raw and exposed. "I'm so sorry." The words, when they came, were quiet, almost lost in the noise of the room. But I heard them. For years, I had longed to hear those words for a myriad of slights and hurts, both large and small. Now that they were here, I wasn't sure what to do with them. "Sorry for what, David?" I asked, my voice genuinely curious. "Are you sorry that you didn't call? Are you sorry you let your wife insult me and everything I've ever stood for? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" The questions were sharp, but I didn't say them with anger. I said them with the cool precision of a surgeon making an incision, trying to get to the root of the disease. He looked away, his eyes scanning the faces of the happy diners. He watched as Sandy knelt down to talk to a little girl, tucking a napkin into her collar. He saw Frank, standing in the kitchen doorway, watching us with a fiercely protective gaze. He saw the community, the warmth, the life that was pulsating in this room, a life that had absolutely nothing to do with him. "All of it," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry for all of it." He looked back at me, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Tiffany, she has a way of making everything seem so logical. The networking, the image, the upgrade. It all sounds so important when she's saying it. And I went along. It was easier to go along." "It's always easier to go along, David," I said softly. "We went to the Gilded Spoon," he said, and a bitter, self-mocking laugh escaped his lips. "It was exactly what she wanted. It was perfect. The tablecloths were so stiff they could have stood up on their own. The waiters all had French accents. The food, it came in these tiny, little towers in the middle of giant plates. It looked like a science experiment." He shook his head, a look of dawning horror on his face. We were sitting there in this cold, silent room. Everyone was talking in whispers. Liam was miserable. He asked the waiter for ketchup for his essence of free-range chicken, and the man looked at him like he was a barbarian. And Tiffany was just beaming, taking pictures with her phone. "Isn't this refined?" she kept saying. "Isn't this an upgrade?" He took a deep breath, the story pouring out of him now, a confession he had been holding in for too long. And I just sat there, looking at my 10-year-old son who was on the verge of tears because he wasn't allowed to have ketchup, and my 8-year-old daughter who was trying to cut a single, microscopic scallop with a giant fork, and I thought, this isn't an upgrade. This is a prison. A beautiful, expensive prison. "So what happened?" I asked, my own heart aching for the grandchildren I should have been with today. "I couldn't do it," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I looked at my plate of artfully arranged foam, and all I could think about was your stuffing. Your lumpy, imperfect, delicious stuffing. I thought about the noise, the chaos of your house. I thought about Dad wearing that stupid pilgrim hat, and I couldn't breathe. So I stood up, right in the middle of the palate cleansing sorbet. And I told Tiffany I was leaving. I told her I was going to find my mother and my Thanksgiving. His confession hung in the air between us. It was more than I had ever expected, more than I had allowed myself to hope for. He hadn't just come because he felt guilty. He had come because he was hungry. Not just for my food, but for the authenticity, the realness, that he had allowed his wife to trade away for a hollow, glittering prize. I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time in years. I saw the man he had become, weak and easily led, but I also saw the boy he had been, the boy who still lived somewhere deep inside, the boy who knew the difference between a house and a home. I wanted to reach out, to hug him, to tell him that everything was going to be all right. But it wasn't my job to make things all right for him anymore. He was a grown man, and he had to find his own way back. So, I said, my voice gentle but firm, "What do you want, David?" He looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, why are you here? Are you here for a handout? For me to tell you it's okay, to welcome you back with open arms and pretend nothing happened?" "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "No, I don't deserve that." "Then what?" He looked around the restaurant again, at the volunteers hustling in and out of the kitchen, at the mountains of dirty dishes piling up. He looked at my apron, spattered with gravy and cranberry sauce. He looked at my hands, raw and red from a day of hard work. And then he did something that astonished me. He started to take off his $1,000 cashmere coat. "I want to help," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "If you'll let me." He folded the coat neatly and laid it over the back of an empty chair. He then began to roll up the sleeves of his crisp, white designer shirt. "What can I do? Do you need a dishwasher? A busboy? I'll do anything." For a long moment, I was speechless. This was not the son I knew. The son I knew wouldn't know which end of a dish rag to hold. He had been raised in a world where other people cleaned up messes. I looked over his shoulder and saw Frank standing in the kitchen doorway, his arms crossed, a single eyebrow raised in a silent question. "What's it gonna be, boss?" His expression seemed to say. I had a choice. I could turn him away. I could tell him it was too little, too late. I could give him the rejection he so richly deserved, a taste of the same bitter medicine he had forced me to swallow. It would be just. It would be fair. But as I looked at my son, his sleeves rolled up, his hands looking pale and useless, waiting for my command, I didn't feel a need for justice. I just felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the first step. Maybe a man can't find his way home until he has truly understood what it feels like to be lost. "We're running low on clean plates," I said, my voice all business. "The dishwasher is in the back. Frank will show you how it works. And just so you know," I added, a small, wry smile touching my lips, "the pay is terrible, but you get a share of the profits." A look of profound, overwhelming relief washed over his face. It was the look of a man who had been granted a reprieve he knew he didn't deserve. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," I said, pointing towards the kitchen. "You haven't seen the state of the pot scrubbing station yet. Now get to work. My guests are waiting for their pie." He gave me a small, grateful nod and walked towards the kitchen. Frank watched him approach, then grunted and jerked his head towards the back. David disappeared into the steam and clatter of the war zone we called a scullery. I stood there for a moment, watching the space where he had been, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something more fragile, more tentative. It was the possibility of a beginning. Sandy came up beside me, a pot of coffee in her hand. "Did that just happen?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Did the guy in the $100 shirt just volunteer for dish duty?" "It seems so," I said. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft with a genuine concern that touched me deeply. "I am," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was the absolute truth. I really am. For the rest of the afternoon, I didn't see David, but I was aware of him. I heard his voice, uncharacteristically hesitant, asking Frank how to load the industrial dishwasher. I saw a flash of his white shirt as he carried a heavy bin of trash out to the dumpster. Through the small, circular window in the kitchen door, I caught a glimpse of him, standing over a 3-compartment sink, his hands submerged in greasy water, scrubbing a roasting pan with a level of concentration he usually reserved for a legal brief. He was clumsy, he was slow, but he was working. The restaurant stayed full until late in the evening. We ran out of turkey around 6 o'clock, but no one seemed to mind. We started making grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, and people were just as grateful. The party had taken on a life of its own. Someone had brought a guitar, and a spontaneous sing-along had started in the corner. The place was filled with the sound of off-key but joyful voices. By 9 o'clock, the last of the guests had drifted away, their bellies full, their faces wreathed in smiles, leaving a trail of heartfelt thank yous in their wake. The restaurant was a disaster zone. Every table was covered in dirty plates and crumpled napkins. The floor was sticky. The kitchen looked like a bomb had gone off in it. My little army of volunteers was exhausted but triumphant. We stood in the midst of the happy chaos, a band of weary soldiers surveying the battlefield after a great victory. "We did it," Sandy said, her voice hoarse, leaning against the counter for support. "We actually did it." "We sure did," I said, a deep, bone-weary satisfaction settling over me. Just then, David emerged from the kitchen. He was a wreck. His hair was damp with sweat. His fancy shirt was stained with something I hoped was just gravy. He had a smudge of what looked like cranberry sauce on his cheek. He was holding a dish towel in his hand, and he looked more exhausted than I had ever seen him. But he also looked content. "The last of the pots are clean," he announced, his voice rough. "The kitchen is, well, it's not clean, but it's cleaner." Frank came out behind him, wiping his hands on a towel. He stopped beside David and, to my utter shock, clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture so forceful it nearly sent David stumbling. "He's slow," Frank grunted, looking at me, "and he complains a lot." David opened his mouth to protest, but Frank cut him off. "But he learns fast, and he's not afraid to get his hands dirty. He can come back tomorrow." Coming from Frank, it was the highest possible praise. David looked at me, a hopeful, questioning look in his eyes. The day was over. The work was done. What now? The bell on the front door jingled one last time. We all turned. My heart, which I thought had no more room for surprises, did a violent lurch. It was Tiffany. And she was holding Liam and Sophie by the hands. The air in the restaurant, which a moment before had been thick with the warm, celebratory fug of coffee, pie, and exhaustion, suddenly became thin and cold. A pocket of silence formed around the doorway, an invisible barrier against which the happy chatter of the remaining volunteers seemed to break and die. Tiffany stood there, a perfect, frozen sculpture of outrage. She was dressed in a chic, cream-colored wool coat, her hair was perfectly coiffed, and her makeup was flawless. She looked as if she had been teleported from a sterile, high-fashion magazine shoot directly into the beautiful, chaotic, gravy-spattered heart of my life. Her eyes, wide with a horror that was almost comical, took in the scene: the sticky floors, the mountains of dirty dishes, the weary but smiling volunteers. And then they landed on David. She stared at his stained shirt, his sweaty hair, the dirty dish towel still clutched in his hand. Her lip curled in a silent, visceral expression of disgust. It was the look a person might give to a piece of rotten fruit they had just discovered in their pristine refrigerator. But the children saw none of that. "Grandma," Liam's voice, a pure, high note of joy, cut through the tension. He dropped Tiffany's hand and launched himself across the room, his little legs pumping. He didn't see the mess. He saw me. He crashed into my legs and hugged them tight, burying his face in my sauce-stained apron. "It smells like your house in here," he exclaimed, his voice muffled. Sophie, always more cautious, followed a little more slowly, her eyes big and round. She looked at her father, a question in her gaze. David, for his part, seemed frozen, a man caught between two tectonic plates. I knelt down, my tired knees protesting, and wrapped my arms around Liam. I pulled him close, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of my grandson. "Hello, my sweet boy," I whispered into his hair. I looked up and met Sophie's gaze. "Hello, my little Sophie bean." A hesitant smile touched her lips. "Daddy," she said, her voice small, "your shirt is dirty." Before David could respond, Tiffany found her voice. It was a low, dangerous hiss, a sound like tearing silk. "David, what in the name of God are you doing?" She strode into the restaurant, her expensive heels clicking ominously on the linoleum floor. The volunteers, sensing a predator, instinctively moved back, creating a clear, gladiatorial arena in the center of the room. Frank crossed his arms, his posture a solid wall of "don't even think about it." "Get your coat," Tiffany commanded, her voice an icy whip. She didn't look at me. It was as if I were a piece of the shabby decor beneath her notice. "We are leaving, now." David didn't move. He just looked at his wife, and for the first time there was no fear in his eyes. There was just a great, profound weariness. "No," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a slammed door. Tiffany's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up. "What did you just say to me?" "I said no," he repeated, his voice a little stronger this time. He took a step forward, putting himself between his wife and the kitchen, between her world and mine. "We're not leaving. I'm not leaving." "Are you insane?" She spat, her voice rising. "Look at you. You look like one of the vagrants she's been feeding. You are a partner in a prestigious law firm, not a scullery maid in a homeless shelter. We have a reputation." "I don't care about our reputation, Tiffany," he said, and the simple, honest statement seemed to suck all the air out of her fury. "I haven't cared for a long time. I just didn't have the guts to admit it." He looked at Liam, who was still clinging to me, and at Sophie, who was now hiding behind a table. All day, at that ridiculous restaurant, all I could think was, this isn't it. This isn't what life is supposed to feel like. This, he gestured around the room, at the tired volunteers, at the dirty plates, at me, this is real. This is my mother feeding people who needed to be fed. This is what matters. Tiffany let out a laugh that was more like a bark, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "What matters? David, she squandered her entire life savings on this pathetic little project. She's going to be destitute in 6 months, and then who do you think is going to have to pick up the pieces?" I had heard enough. I stood up slowly, my hand resting protectively on Liam's head. I met Tiffany's furious gaze, and I was not afraid. I was home. "Don't you worry about me, Tiffany," I said, my voice cool and calm. "I have never felt less destitute in my entire life. I have a business, I have a community, I have a purpose. And I have friends." I glanced at Frank and Sandy, who were watching with unwavering loyalty, "who have my back. I have everything I need." "And pie," Liam piped up. "Do you have pie, Grandma? The fancy restaurant didn't have any good pie." The simple, innocent question was a perfectly aimed dart, deflating Tiffany's rage and pretension in an instant. All the networking, all the posturing, all the refined experiences in the world couldn't compete with a child's desire for a slice of his grandmother's pie. I smiled down at him, my heart overflowing. "Do I have pie?" I said, my voice full of mock surprise. "Sweetheart, I have all the pie in the world. Pecan, apple, and pumpkin. What's your pleasure?" "Pecan," he shouted, his face lighting up. I looked over at Sophie. "How about you, my love? A little slice of apple pie with some ice cream." Sophie nodded eagerly, her earlier hesitation forgotten. She came out from behind the table and took my free hand. "That's it," Tiffany said, her voice shaking with a rage so profound it was almost awe-inspiring. "I'm done. I am not standing here and watching my family choose a slice of cheap pie in this greasy spoon over their own mother." The term greasy spoon was meant to be an insult, but in that moment, I decided to wear it as a badge of honor. She looked at David, her eyes cold and hard as diamonds. "You have 5 seconds to get your children and get in the car, David. Or, I swear to you, the locks will be changed by the time you get home." It was the nuclear option, the final, desperate power play of a queen who had lost control of her kingdom. I watched David's face, my heart in my throat. This was the moment. He could fold. He could revert to the man he had been just that morning, the man who always chose the path of least resistance. He looked at Tiffany, at her rigid posture and furious face. Then he looked down at his children, their faces full of hope and pyrelated anticipation. He looked at his gravy-stained shirt, at his raw, water-wrinkled hands. He looked at me, and then he smiled. A real smile, a tired but genuine smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "Then I guess I'll need to find a new place to stay," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the guitar player in the corner had stopped singing. Tiffany stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. She had played her last, most powerful card, and he had refused to fold. He had called her bluff, and she had nothing left. Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched towards the door. Her exit would have been magnificent, a dramatic, sweeping statement, if she hadn't been so blinded by fury that she failed to notice a small puddle of melted ice on the floor. Her heel hit the puddle, and for a glorious, horrifying second, she pinwheeled her arms, her perfect composure shattering. She managed to regain her balance, but the damage was done. Her retreat was no longer a march, it was a scramble. She wrenched the door open, the little bell jingling mockingly, and then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The collective exhale in the room was a soft, rushing wind. David sagged against a nearby table, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips. He looked like a man who had just survived a car crash. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a kind of terrified freedom. "I think I'm going to need that share of the profits," he said, a weak, shaky grin on his face. I just nodded, my own emotions too jumbled to speak. The tension broke. Sandy let out a whoop of laughter. Arthur started clapping, a slow, steady applause that was soon joined by the rest of the volunteers. They were clapping for David, for me, for all of us. All right, I said, my voice thick with unshed tears of joy and relief. "That's enough drama for one day. A certain young man has a date with a slice of pecan pie, and I think a certain dishwasher has earned one too." I led my grandchildren into the kitchen, a procession of 3. The heart of the restaurant, which had been a place of frantic work all day, was now quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerators. I sat Liam and Sophie at the stainless steel prep table, their legs dangling high off the ground. I cut 2 generous slices of pie, adding a huge scoop of vanilla ice cream to each. As I handed them their plates, David appeared in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just watched us, a look of profound longing on his face. "There's a slice here with your name on it," I said quietly, gesturing to a 3rd plate. He came and sat at the table with his children. The 3 of them ate in a comfortable, happy silence. I watched them, my heart a painful, wonderful knot in my chest. It wasn't the Thanksgiving I had planned. It wasn't the Thanksgiving I had spent 35 years celebrating. It was so much more. I had lost a tradition, but I had gained a purpose. I had lost a son, but it seemed I was in the process of getting a man back. I had lost the illusion of a perfect family, but I had found a real one, forged in a hot kitchen and bound together by loyalty, hard work, and the shared belief that there is no problem in the world that can't be made a little better with a hot meal and a slice of homemade pie. As I watched my son share a bite of his dessert with his daughter, I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was only the beginning. The war was far from over. Tiffany was not a woman who would accept defeat gracefully, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had my army, I had my fortress, and I had a full pantry. Let her come, we'd be ready. The clapping faded, leaving a silence that was both deeply weary and profoundly peaceful. My little army, my newfound family, began to move, not with the frantic energy of the dinner rush, but with the slow, rhythmic purpose of a team that knew its job was not yet done. The cleanup began. David stood in the middle of it all, looking like a man who had just woken from a long and terrible dream. He watched as Sandy started directing volunteers to scrape plates, as Arthur began stacking chairs, as Frank disappeared back into the kitchen, the clang of a pot a moment later signaling that his work was never truly finished. Liam and Sophie, their faces happy and sticky with pie, were starting to droop. Sophie was leaning her head on the table, her eyes half closed. "All right, you two," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I think it's time for bed." A logistical problem, the first of many, presented itself. Bed, where was bed? Here at the restaurant. No, at their pristine, silent house where their mother was probably already shredding their father's belongings. Unlikely. That left my house. My shabby, cluttered, wonderful house. David seemed to realize it at the same time. He looked at me, a new kind of panic in his eyes. Mom, I don't have a car. Tiffany drove. I don't have anything. No clothes for the kids, no pajamas, no. We'll figure it out, I said, cutting him off before he could spiral. It was a sentence I had said to him 1,000 times when he was a boy, after a scraped knee, a failed test, a broken heart. We always do. I turned to my crew. Everyone, I said, my voice projecting through the room. You have all been magnificent, more than I could have ever hoped for. But it's late, and you all have families and homes to get back to. Go, rest. We'll tackle the rest of this tomorrow. There were protests, of course. We can stay, Clara, Maria insisted. Many hands make light work. You've given us more than light work, I said, my heart swelling. You've given me hope, and now I'm giving you the rest of the night off. That's a boss's order. Reluctantly, they began to pack up, a slow procession of hugs and heartfelt, happy Thanksgivings. They were no longer just volunteers, they were my people. When the last of them had gone, only 4 of us remained amidst the wreckage: me, Sandy, Frank, and Arthur. And David and the children. I'm staying, Sandy said, folding her arms. It wasn't an offer, it was a statement of fact. Me too, Frank grunted from the kitchen doorway. Someone's gotta make sure he jerked his head towards David, didn't break the dishwasher. David actually smiled, a tired but real smile. It's still in one piece, he said. Barely. We'll get a taxi for you and the kids, Clara, Arthur said, already pulling his phone out. You've been on your feet for 18 hours. Thank you, Arthur, I said. While he made the call, I went into the kitchen. David followed me. He stood awkwardly by the door as I started packing up a few containers of leftovers. Turkey, stuffing, a healthy portion of mashed potatoes. What are you doing? He asked. Packing you a lunch for tomorrow, I said without looking up. You're going to be a dishwasher. You'll need your strength. He was silent for a long moment. Mom, you don't have to employ me. I stopped what I was doing and finally turned to look at him. David, I said, my voice serious. Today you made a choice. It was a hard choice and a brave one. I am proud of you for that, but it was just the first choice. There are going to be 1,000 more, and they are all going to be harder. You are going to be in a war with Tiffany, and it is going to be ugly. She is going to try to take your children, your money, and your reputation. You need a place to stand. A place to fight from. For now, this is it. I gestured around the messy, beautiful kitchen. So, yes, I have to employ you, because you're my son and you're in trouble. But also because I saw you scrub a pot today until your knuckles were white and you didn't quit. Frank is right. You can come back tomorrow. He nodded slowly, absorbing my words. She'll try to say I'm an unfit father, he said, his voice hollow, that I abandoned my family to go work in a greasy spoon. He used her words, but they sounded different coming from him, stripped of their venom, leaving only a sad, ironic echo. And what will we say? I asked, challenging him. He looked at me, and a flicker of the sharp, legal mind he was known for reappeared. We'll say I chose to spend Thanksgiving with my entire family. That I chose to provide a model of service and hard work for my children, instead of a model of empty consumerism. We'll say I chose a place of love over a place of pretense. Good, I said, a wave of pride washing over me. That's very good. You're going to need to remember that. Write it down. Arthur called out that the taxi had arrived. I bundled a sleepy Sophie into my arms, her small body a warm, trusting weight against my shoulder. David took a groggy Liam by the hand. As we walked towards the door, I paused and looked back. Sandy was wiping down the counter. Arthur was sweeping the floor. Frank was taking inventory in the walk-in. They weren't just employees. They were the sentinels, guarding the fortress until morning. The ride to my house was quiet. The children dozed in the back of the taxi, their heads lolling against the seats. David stared out the window at the passing streetlights, his face a mask of exhaustion and worry. As we pulled up to the curb, the house looked small and unassuming in the darkness. The porch light I had left on cast a warm, yellow glow. It doesn't look shabby at all, David said quietly, as if reading my mind, as if remembering the insult that had started all of this. "It looks like home." "It is," I said. "It always has been." Inside, the house was chilly and smelled faintly of dust and old memories. I turned up the thermostat and set about making beds. I put the children in my room, tucking them into my big, soft bed, a place where they had built forts and listened to bedtime stories 100 times before. Sophie stirred as I pulled the covers over her. "Grandma," she mumbled. "I don't have my pajamas with the pink bunnies." My heart broke a little. "I know, sweetheart," I whispered, stroking her hair. "We'll wear big t-shirts tonight, and it will be like a slumber party. And tomorrow, we'll go on an adventure to get all new pajamas, any kind you want." "Even the ones with glitter?" she asked, her eyes fluttering closed. "Especially the ones with glitter," I promised. I left them sleeping and went back out to the living room. David was standing by the mantelpiece looking at the photographs just as I had on that terrible morning 2 weeks ago. He was holding the picture of me and Robert our last Thanksgiving. "I miss him," he said, his voice thick. "God, I miss him. He would have known what to do. He would never have let things get this bad." "Your father wasn't a saint, David," I said softly, coming to stand beside him. "He made mistakes, but he always knew what was important. He would have been so angry with you. And then he would have been so proud of you. And then he would have put you to work scrubbing pots, too." A watery smile touched his lips. He put the photograph back carefully. "What happens now, Mom?" "Now," I said, "we get some sleep. And tomorrow we get a lawyer. Not one of your fancy corporate friends. We need a shark, a real family law shark." Just as I said the words, David's phone, which had been sitting silently on the end table, buzzed. Then it buzzed again, and again, and again. It was a frantic, angry, insistent series of buzzes that sounded like a trapped hornet. He picked it up, his face grim. He didn't have to say who it was from. "Don't answer it," I said. "It's not a call, it's texts," he said, his thumb scrolling down the screen. His face grew paler with each message he read. "She knows the kids are with me." "Of course she does. You told her you were coming here." She's demanding I bring them back. Tonight, now." "And if you don't?" He looked up from the phone, his eyes wide with a new, fresh horror. "She says if I don't have her children on her doorstep in 1 hour, she's calling the police." He swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "She's telling them I've kidnapped my own children. She's threatening to file an Amber Alert." The word hung in the silent, sleeping house like a poison gas. Amber Alert. It was a declaration of war unlike any I had imagined. She wasn't just going to fight him with lawyers in a courtroom. She was going to burn his entire life to the ground, and she was going to use the love for his own children as the accelerant. I looked at my son, his face a mask of pure terror, and I felt that old, familiar maternal instinct rise up, fierce and protective. But it was different now. It wasn't just the instinct to soothe and comfort. It was the cold, hard instinct of a general whose fortress was under siege and whose first, most critical battle had just begun. Tiffany had fired her first shot, and it was a cannonball aimed directly at our hearts.